Our second lesson today comes from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 51, verses 1 through 6, which can be found on page 667 in your pew Bibles. Let us listen for the Lord to speak. Listen to me, you that pursue righteousness, you that seek the Lord. Look to the rock from which you were hewn, and the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham and your father, and to Sarah who bore you, for he was but one when I called him, but I blessed him and made him many. For the Lord will comfort Zion. He will comfort all her waste places, and will make her wilderness like Eden, her desert like the garden of the Lord. Joy and gladness will be found in her, thanksgiving and the voice of song. Listen to me, my people, and give heed to me, my nation, for a teaching will go out from me, and my justice for a light to the peoples. I will bring near my deliverance swiftly. My salvation has gone out, and my arms will rule the peoples. The coastlands wait for me, and for my arm they hope. Lift up your eyes to the heavens and look at the earth beneath, for the heavens will vanish like smoke. The earth will wear out like a garment, and those who live on it will die like gnats, but my salvation will be forever, and my deliverance will never be ended. This is the word of the Lord. The world is full of sound. Even when there is nothing to record it, sound waves are being emitted. And some sounds are subtle, while others are abrupt. Some are pleasing to the ears, while others literally can cause us pain. Louis Caliani, author and dialect coach, wrote, "Sound has a profound effect on the senses. It can be both heard and felt. It can even be seen with the mind's eye. It can almost be tasted and smelled. Sound can evoke responses of the five senses." We are no stranger to the effect sound can have upon us. We have all heard sounds that can bring back memories, that can bring us comfort, that can startle us, or even move us to tears. And sometimes, the overabundance of sounds in our world is so overwhelming that they become a collective noise and lose their distinctive effect. Sometimes that noise is found in the voices and the stories that we hear pouring from our news channels and our favorite social media outlets. That noise is heard and felt in the disagreements and vitriol over agendas and policies. That noise is heard and comes from the cynicism over the way things are, as well as the pessimism that things will never change. It will only get worse, some say. And we lose ourselves in the noise, becoming numb to the stories that should actually move us to action. The noise can be heard and felt. It can even be seen in the mind's eye. It can almost be tasted and smelled. The noise can evoke responses from the five senses. And we find ourselves feeling like the old man Peter. There's too much noise. Do you ever feel like there's just too much noise? I must confess that sometimes the noise is so loud that I can't even hear my own voice, let alone the voice of the divine. The noise can get so loud that it is hard to hear the sounds of hope in a world that seems to be so full of despair. Yes, the world is full of noise. And there are reasons for lament, that's for sure. One cannot see the images of what's happening in Ferguson, Iraq, Syria, Israel, Palestine, and the list could go on without longing for peace. One cannot hear the news of another young death, another suicide, another painful diagnosis without praying for mercy. One cannot learn about oppression, inequality, discrimination, and violence without crying out for justice. And within the struggle, there seems to be no song of hope. It can feel as though we are stuck. And this is especially true when the loudest voices want us to believe that this is just the way things are and things are going to not change ever. And granted, if we're honest with ourselves, we would admit that there are times when it can be difficult to see any other way or hear any other news but bad news. But as people of faith, we must not allow ourselves to remain there. There is another story into which we are called to participate. In another time, in another place, the people were overwhelmed by the sounds of despair, like us, sounds of hopelessness. The people of Israel had been taken into captivity by the Babylonian Empire in the 6th century BC. They were removed from their homeland, which had been destroyed by their invaders, and it now lay desolate, deserted. It was a land that once held so much promise, a land that represented their past and a land that was supposed to hold their future, and it now was just a wasteland and a distant memory. The people had been forced to leave their land and all of the things that they had grown close to and familiar with. And there was a reason for lament, that is for sure. The people had been in captivity for over 2 generations. And understandably, they had lost their identity and could now only hear the words of despair. The noise of the voices who were convinced that this was the way it would always be. They'd lost the sound of faith. They grieved a dry and barren, deserted land void of hope. They lived lives mostly void of good news, void of song. It was into this context that the voice of the prophet rings out with a different song in what is often called 2nd Isaiah. The prophet cries out, encouraging the people to hear a different sound than the one that was dominating their everyday lives. And of the role of the prophet, Abraham Heschel, who's a noted theologian, author, and activist of the middle of the 20th century, wrote, "The prophet's ear perceives the silent sigh. While others are intoxicated with the here and now, the prophet has a vision of an end." And then he goes on, and the prophet's task is exhortation, not mere prediction. And this is what we have in the beginning of Isaiah 51, a text written to the exiled people. And the end that the prophet sees is divine purpose. He employs notes that are 1 octave too high for our ears to pick up. The prophet of Isaiah 51 speaks of a sound that was rooted in their past and would prove to shape the future into which they were called to walk. It was a sound of hope, rooted in the covenantal promise of God. So our text from Isaiah 51 begins with a familiar imperative for the people of Israel to listen. Upon hearing this, those listening to the prophet's voice may have been reminded of a passage that is called the Shema from Deuteronomy 6. Deuteronomy 6 has literally shaped the lives and the faith of the community of our Jewish brothers and sisters for millennia. And it begins with that same imperative in Hebrew, Shema. It's translated listen or hear. The passage reads, "Listen, hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one." And this is the passage that is written on the hearts and the door frames of their homes even today. It is the song they sing as they sit and as they rise. And in our text this morning, the prophet calls out to these people, these same people, those who pursue righteousness, people of faith, to listen once again. They're to open their ears to hear a different voice, a different sound in the midst of the noise of their more than real despair. So, what is the message that Isaiah is calling his hearers to heed? The message is to look. To look beyond the desperation of their current circumstances and look back into the lives of those who have gone before them. The prophet calls his hearers to look to God's activity. The prophet calls the people to not only listen and remember who they are, but he also calls them to consider the promises fulfilled in the past. Promises that grew out of the original covenant made with their common ancestors, Abraham and Sarah. And with the same imperative strength, the prophet cries out to the people, "Look to the rock from which you were hewn, and the quarry from which you were dug. Look to Abraham your father, and to Sarah who bore you, for he was but one when I called him, but I blessed him and made him many." According to Hebrew Bible scholar Walter Brueggemann, the exiles are to recall the ancestors in order to ponder the memory that Yahweh gives miraculous blessing to this people in the most unlikely circumstances. Now, this theme is a major part of the story of the people of Israel. God acts in decisive and mighty ways within even the most dire of circumstances, even in a barren land. When hope seems dashed upon the craggy rocks of their present reality, they were to look back to the divine activity of promise. The God who had acted is acting now and will act again. And this knowledge of the past activity of a mighty God should give all who pursue faith confidence that this same God will continue to act in this same pattern. God made flowers bloom in the desert once before. The prophet reminds those held in captivity that this same God will make the desert wilderness into a blooming Eden paradise once again. Where there now is only lament and a barren wasteland, God will bring the beautiful sound of songs of joy and the sweet fragrance of blossoms of hope. The prophet's words do not end there. The hearer, the reader, hears the same imperative that began our passage. Listen. And this time we, are to pay attention to the teaching that will pour out from the mouth of the Lord. A teaching rooted in the justice of the Lord that will be a light for all people. The heavens and the earth will pass away, says the prophet, as will all who inhabit it. The way things are will not be the way things will always be. But God's salvation will be forever. And divine deliverance will never be ended. God has acted in the past, and God's activity will never end, in spite of the gravity of the current circumstances. These are the assurances that are not only meant to buoy the people of God, but are also to serve as a beacon of hope to all people. In the midst of deep despair and the loud noise of hopelessness, it is easy to forget that the promises of God never change. The all-inclusiveness of God's grace rings out. The mission given to the exiles is to carry the message of God's compassion, justice, and truth. Israel's covenant with God was to be a light and a blessing to all people. The way of God was shining through the people of God, even in the midst of the cacophony of noise in which they lived. And in many ways, the church, the whole church, has lost itself in the noise of bad news. We not only hear the bad news of our culture, but we also hear the voices that tell us that the church is dying. We hear the opinions of others that there is nothing that the church can do about it. I don't want to minimize the despair or the pain or the discouragement that can be felt by such news. Those emotions are real. However, there's another sound, and it's a sound that has never ceased. It's the sound of hope from a covenantal God who speaks words of promise through the voices of those who have gone before us. Ron Allen, a former professor of mine, writes, "Robbed of memory, everyone is a stranger to us, and we are strangers to ourselves. A forgetful community is no longer aware of what it is about, what its purpose is, or whom it loves." It's time to listen to the words of the prophet. A prophet who calls us to hear a different story, a different way. The world gets so noisy that I must confess I can no longer hear the voice of God. And we need someone to hear it for us. And this is where the voice of the prophet breaks through the noise to speak a word of truth, giving us hope that there is a different way. One author writes, "The perceptive ear of faith will still hear God's voice in spite of screaming cynicism and doubt, reminding us that God's salvation is sure and eternal, and it even outlasts all of creation." The following passage is found in a captivating small book entitled "The Impossible Will Take a Little While." And it was told by Sonia Tinsley to the author of that book, and she says, "Every day presents infinite reasons to believe that change cannot happen. Infinite reasons to give up. But I always tell myself, Sonia, you have to pick your team. It seems to me that there are two teams in this world, and you can find evidence to support the arguments of both." She says the trademark of one team is cynicism. They tell you that what you're doing doesn't matter, why nothing is ever going to change, why no matter how hard you work, you are going to fail. And they seem to get satisfaction out of explaining how we'll always have injustice. You can't change human nature, they say. It's foolish to try. And from their experience, they might be right. But then, there's another group of people who admit that they don't know how things will turn out, but they've decided to work for change. They're always telling stories of faith being rewarded, of the way things could be different, of how their own lives have changed. They give you reasons why you shouldn't give up. Testimonials why we've yet to see our full potential as a species. They believe that we're partners in God's creation and that change is really possible. Then she says, "If I'm going to stick with somebody, I'd rather stick with people who have a sense of possibility and hope. I just know that's the side I want to be on." People of faith, it's time. It's time for us to hear a different voice in the midst of the noise that constantly surrounds us. Now, hearing this voice, this sound, is not to deny the existence of the struggle. No, the struggle is real. But giving heed to this voice is choosing to live into the hope of God found through the resurrected Christ. We as a people of faith are called to live into this different tune. We are called to see a way, even when there doesn't appear to be a way, and then have the courage to live into it. So in our noisy world, may we have the courage to listen to a different voice calling out to us. May we look at the witness of the lives of those who have gone before us that give testimony to the activity of a covenantal God. And may we live lives that prove to be a song in the desert and a light to all people, pointing them to the all-inclusiveness of God's grace. Amen.